The ring lay cold on the nightstand when Julian Whitmore pushed open the door to his wife's chamber, and his heart dropped before his mind understood why. The room was empty. The curtains moved with a draft from an open window, and the candle beside the bed had burned down to nothing. Eleanor was gone, but that moment was still hours away. On this particular evening, 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor sat alone at the long dining table, her plate untouched, listening to the clock on the wall count away the minutes until her husband might finally arrive. He did not come. She had stopped counting how many nights this had happened. The Duke of Ashcombe was a man who kept his promises to merchants, to tenants, to members of Parliament, but somehow never to her. Eleanor picked at the edge of her napkin and told herself, as she always did, that tonight would be no different from any other night in this grand, cold house. Windermere Hall had 40 rooms, and not one of them felt like home. She had come to this house as a bride of 19, full of quiet hope that love might grow between two people bound by contract rather than affection. Her father had arranged the match to settle old debts and secure a connection to one of the wealthiest families in the country. Julian's father had wanted the same thing from the other side, a joining of land and name. Neither man had asked the two young people standing at the altar whether they wanted any of it. At first, Eleanor believed patience would be rewarded. She believed that kindness, offered again and again, would eventually be returned. She had learned, in 3 years, that belief alone could not build a marriage. A servant entered the dining room, an older woman named Margaret who had been with Eleanor since her arrival at Windermere Hall. Margaret's eyes were kind, and tonight they held a flicker of sympathy that Eleanor did not want to see. "Shall I have your plate taken away, my lady?" "Yes, thank you, Margaret." Eleanor folded her napkin with more care than it required. "I find I am not hungry tonight." The Duke sent word he would be late. "Estate matters," the messenger said. Eleanor nodded, as though this explained everything, though it explained nothing at all. Estate matters had kept Julian away from breakfast for a week. Estate matters had kept him from her birthday, from the spring assembly, from the small dinner she had planned for his own mother's visit last autumn. She rose from the table and walked toward the library, where at least the books did not disappoint her. The library was the one room in Windermere Hall that felt like it belonged to her. She had chosen the curtains herself, a deep green that matched nothing else in the house, a small act of rebellion no one had noticed or cared to mention. She settled into the chair by the window and opened a book she had already read twice, letting the familiar words carry her away from her own life for an hour. It was near 10 o'clock when she heard the front door and the low voice of her husband speaking to a servant in the hall. She sat very still, listening for his footsteps to turn toward the library, half expecting, as she always did, half hoping. The footsteps went the other way, toward his study. Eleanor closed her book. She had married a stranger, and 3 years had not changed that fact. Julian Whitmore was polite to her at breakfast when he appeared at all. He inquired after her health when illness kept her in bed. He signed the letters she wrote to her family with his own name beside hers, a formality that cost him nothing. But he had never once asked her what she dreamed of, what she feared, what she wanted her life to become. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has always been in the room, familiar and unremarkable. She did not know, could not have known, that Julian carried his own silence like a stone in his chest, that his distance was not indifference but something closer to fear. She only knew what she saw, and what she saw was a husband who preferred ledgers to her company. The next morning brought a letter that would change everything, though Eleanor did not know it yet, as she broke the seal at the breakfast table. The handwriting belonged to her grandmother's companion, a woman named Charlotte who had served the elderly Constance Bellamy for over a decade. Eleanor read the first line and felt her stomach tighten. Her grandmother was unwell. The physician did not know how much time remained. Eleanor set the letter down and pressed her fingers to her lips, willing herself not to cry at the table. Constance was the one person in Eleanor's family who had never treated her marriage as a transaction, the one person who had asked, on Eleanor's wedding day, whether she was certain this was what she wanted. Eleanor had said yes because she believed it then. Now she needed to see her grandmother again, needed it the way she needed air. She would ask Julian for leave to travel. Surely he would understand this. Surely even a man so buried in his own affairs would grant his wife permission to sit beside a dying woman she loved. She found him in his study that afternoon, bent over papers with a focus that did not break when she entered. The room smelled of ink and old wood, and the fire had burned low though the day was cold. Julian. She had stopped calling him my lord in private within the first month of their marriage, though the intimacy of his given name had never brought them closer. "I received word from Charlotte this morning. My grandmother is very ill." He did not look up. "I am sorry to hear it." I would like to travel to see her, as soon as possible. There was a pause, brief but heavy, before he finally raised his eyes to hers. Something crossed his face, something Eleanor could not name, gone before she could study it. The roads to the north are difficult this time of year. And I have guests arriving from London next week. Your presence will be expected. Eleanor stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where he told her the guests could wait, where he told her family mattered more than politics. That part never came. She may not live long enough for the roads to improve, Julian. I am sure Charlotte is capable of managing her care. He returned his attention to the papers on his desk, and the conversation, as far as he was concerned, had ended. We will discuss it after the guests have gone. Eleanor stood in the doorway a moment longer, waiting for him to say something else, to soften the refusal, to at least meet her eyes again. He did not. She turned and left the study, and for the first time in 3 years, something inside her did not simply ache. It hardened. She walked the long gallery of family portraits that lined the corridor outside his study, past generations of Whitmores who had built this house and this name, and she stopped in front of the window that looked out over the gardens. Rain had begun to fall, gray and steady, matching her mood so perfectly it almost made her laugh. She thought of her grandmother's cottage, small and warm, filled with the smell of bread and the sound of real laughter. She thought of the woman who used to sit with her for hours, listening to Eleanor's hopes as though they mattered, telling her stories of her own youth, teaching her that a woman's worth was not measured by the ring on her finger, or the size of the house she lived in. She thought of Julian's face, so composed, so unmoved, and she felt something shift inside her chest. That evening, Margaret found her mistress standing at the window in her private sitting room long after the candles should have been extinguished. "My lady, you will catch a chill." "Margaret." Eleanor did not turn from the glass. "Do you think it is possible to love someone who does not see you at all?" Margaret set down the tray she carried, her expression careful. "I think, my lady, that a person can only give what they have inside them to give. Some men keep so much locked away, even they forget the key. That is a kind way of saying he does not care. It is a true way of saying I do not know his heart. Only you can decide what you are willing to wait for and what you are not." Eleanor turned from the window then, and in the candlelight, Margaret saw something new in her mistress's eyes, something that had not been there before, not anger exactly, something steadier and more dangerous to a marriage built on silence. Resolve. "I do not intend to wait much longer," Eleanor said quietly. "For anything." Margaret did not ask what she meant. She simply nodded, poured the tea, and left her mistress alone with her thoughts, not knowing that this quiet evening was the true beginning of everything that would follow, the first small crack in a wall that had been 3 years in the building. Alone again, Eleanor sat by the fire and let her mind travel back to the early days of her marriage, when she had still believed things might change. She remembered the first winter, when she had waited up for Julian with a shawl she had sewn herself, hoping he might notice the effort. He had thanked her politely and hung it by the door, where it remained still, untouched since that night. She remembered asking him once, in a rare, unguarded moment, what he had wanted to be as a boy, before dukedoms and duty had claimed him. He had looked at her as though the question itself confused him, and then he had simply said that a duke's son wants nothing but to become a duke, and the conversation had closed like a door. She had told herself then that time would soften him. She had told herself that a man raised without warmth could still learn to give it, if given enough patience. 3 years had taught her that patience was not the same as hope, and that hope without any answer in return could hollow a person out slowly, without them even noticing the loss until it was nearly complete. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows of Windermere Hall, steady and unbothered by the quiet turmoil inside. Eleanor thought of her grandmother's small hands, of the way Constance used to hold her face and tell her that a woman who forgets her own worth teaches everyone around her to forget it too. She thought of how long it had been since anyone in this house had looked at her the way her grandmother once had, with open, unguarded love. She rose from her chair before the fire had fully died and walked to the writing desk in the corner of her sitting room. She did not know yet what she intended to write, only that the restlessness inside her needed somewhere to go. She dipped her pen and began a letter to Charlotte, promising she would find a way north no matter what stood in her path, promising her grandmother would not spend her final days without her granddaughter beside her. She sealed the letter with a steadiness that surprised her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor did not feel like a woman waiting for permission to live her own life. She felt, instead, like a woman beginning to remember that she had one. The candle burned low as she sat with the letter in her hands, and somewhere beyond the walls of the study down the hall, Her husband remained bent over papers that meant nothing beside the quiet unraveling taking place just rooms away. A man too absorbed in duty to notice the woman he had married was slipping further from his reach with every silent evening that passed between them. Charlotte's second letter arrived 3 days later, and this time the words on the page made Eleanor's hands shake before she had even finished the first line. Constance had taken a turn for the worse in the night. The physician did not expect her to see the end of the month. Eleanor did not wait for breakfast to be cleared. She found Julian in the breakfast room himself, an unusual occurrence, and she seized the moment before he could disappear into his study for the day. "Julian, I must speak with you." He set down his cup, his expression already distant, already halfway to the papers waiting for him elsewhere. "Yes? My grandmother is dying. Charlotte writes that she may not last the month. I need to go to her now, not after your guests have come and gone." Something flickered across his face again, that same unreadable expression she had seen days before, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, buried beneath the composure he wore like armor. "Eleanor, I understand this is difficult. But Lord Pemberton and his wife arrive in 5 days, and the arrangements cannot be undone at this late hour. It would reflect poorly on this house." "This house?" Eleanor repeated, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. "You are worried about how a cancelled dinner will reflect on this house, while my grandmother lies dying in hers." "I did not say it in those terms. You did not need to." The meaning was clear enough. Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something like an apology forming behind his eyes, some crack in the wall he had built around himself. But he only said, "We will speak of this after the Pembertons have gone," and rose from the table, leaving his tea unfinished and his wife standing alone in the empty breakfast room for the second time that week. Eleanor stood very still until she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor, and then she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of tears before wiping them away and squaring her shoulders. She would not ask him again. She understood now, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that asking had never been the right approach. Julian would not give what he did not know how to give, and waiting for him to change had cost her 3 years already. She would not let it cost her the last days of her grandmother's life as well. She began, quietly and carefully, to plan. Margaret was the only person Eleanor trusted with the truth. That evening, as the maid helped her prepare for bed, Eleanor spoke in a low voice, watching the door as though Julian himself might appear behind it. "I intend to go to my grandmother, Margaret, with or without the Duke's blessing." Margaret's hands paused on the laces of Eleanor's gown. "My lady, that is a serious step. If the Duke learns you left without his consent, there could be consequences. For your reputation, and for mine, should it come out that I helped. I know what I am asking of you. If you wish no part of it, I will understand completely, and I will never speak of this conversation again." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and then she resumed her work with steady hands. "You have been kind to me since the day you arrived in this house, my lady, when no one else troubled themselves to learn my name. I will help you, but we must be careful and clever." Over the following days, a plan took shape between them in whispered conversations held only when the household had gone quiet. Eleanor would need traveling clothes that did not announce her as a duchess. She would need coin, since she could not simply request funds from the estate without drawing Julian's notice. She began, with great reluctance, to consider selling a small piece of jewelry, a sapphire pendant that had belonged to her own mother, one of the few possessions in this house that truly belonged to her alone. It was during this quiet, tense week that Eleanor first met Lord Sebastian Hale. He had taken a lease on the neighboring estate the previous month, a fact the local gossips had discussed at length without Eleanor paying much attention, absorbed as she was in her own troubles. She encountered him properly at a small gathering hosted by a family friend, a modest evening meant to welcome the new arrival to the county. Julian had declined to attend, citing correspondence that could not wait, and Eleanor had gone alone, grateful for any excuse to leave Windmere Hall's silent halls behind for a few hours. Sebastian Hale was younger than Julian by several years, with an easy warmth that seemed almost foreign to Eleanor after so long in her husband's company. He found her standing near the window during a lull in the evening's music, and instead of the polite, empty conversation she had grown used to, he asked her a real question. "You look as though your thoughts are somewhere far from this room, my lady." Eleanor turned, startled that anyone had noticed. "Is it so obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention." He smiled, and there was nothing calculated in it, only simple friendliness. "Forgive me if that was too forward a thing to say to a woman I have only just met." It was refreshing, actually. Most people in rooms like this speak only of the weather and the quality of the wine. "Then let us speak of neither. Tell me something true instead." Eleanor found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like weeks, and before she quite understood how it happened, she was telling this near stranger about her grandmother, about the cottage in the north filled with the smell of bread, about a childhood spent believing that love, real love, was something ordinary people were allowed to have. She did not tell him about Julian, not directly, but something in the careful way she avoided the subject told Sebastian more than words might have. "You are worried for her," he said gently when she finished, "and you have not yet found a way to reach her side. It is complicated. It rarely needs to be as complicated as we make it." He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "If you ever require assistance, my lady, a carriage, a discreet word to the right person, you need only ask. I do not say this to overstep. I say it because I recognize the look of someone who has been told no by people who ought to have said yes." Eleanor did not answer him directly that evening, though his words stayed with her long after she returned to Windmere Hall and found the house as dark and silent as she had left it. She told herself it meant nothing, that a kind stranger's offer of help was simply that, kindness, and nothing more complicated than gratitude should follow it. But over the following 2 weeks, as the Pembertons arrived and Julian disappeared further into his obligations, Eleanor and Sebastian crossed paths again, at church, at a small assembly in the village, once by accident on the road between their two estates. Each time he was easy company, attentive in a way that had become foreign to her, curious about her thoughts in a way her own husband had never once been. She told herself this was simply friendship. She told herself many things during those weeks, and some of them were even true. The Pembertons' visit came and went in a blur of forced smiles and careful conversation, Eleanor playing the role of dutiful duchess while her grandmother's condition worsened by the day, each letter from Charlotte more urgent than the last. On the final evening of the visit, after the guests had retired and the house had gone quiet, Eleanor found Julian alone in the drawing room, staring into the fire with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something almost haunted. "The Pembertons are pleased with the visit," she said, more to break the silence than anything else. "Good," he answered, not looking up. "That is good." She lingered in the doorway, watching him, wondering for a moment what thoughts occupied him so completely that he could not even meet her eyes. "Julian, my grandmother is not improving. Charlotte fears she has only days left." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost strained. "I will arrange for you to travel next week. Next week may be too late. It is the earliest I can manage." He rose from his chair, still not meeting her gaze, and walked past her toward the door. "I am sorry, Eleanor. I do not say that lightly." She watched him go, and something in the careful way he had said her name, something in the strain she had heard beneath his usual composure, made her wonder for one brief moment if there was more to his distance than simple indifference. But the moment passed, swallowed by exhaustion and grief, and the growing certainty that whatever battle Julian fought within himself, he had no intention of letting her close enough to understand it. That night, alone in her chamber, Eleanor made her decision. She would not wait for next week. She would not wait for permission that arrived too late to matter. She sat at her writing desk and pulled a sheet of paper toward her, intending to write to Charlotte with news of her coming arrival, but her pen stilled above the page as her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the strange look on Julian's face in the drawing room. In 3 years of marriage she had rarely seen him anything but composed, his feelings, if he had any, locked away behind a calm exterior that gave nothing to the world. Tonight, for the briefest moment, that calm had cracked, and something raw had shone through before he mastered it again. She wondered, not for the first time, what exactly it was that Julian carried so carefully hidden. She had heard whispers, over the years, fragments of gossip from servants who did not know she was listening, about a woman named Isabel who had once been meant for him, before Eleanor had ever entered his life. The whispers never went further than a name and a vague sadness attached to it, and Eleanor had never dared to ask him directly, afraid of what silence might follow such a question, more afraid perhaps of what answer might come instead. She pushed the thought aside. Whatever ghosts lived in her husband's past were his to carry, and she had spent 3 years waiting for him to share the weight of them with her. She could not spend her grandmother's final days waiting any longer. She finished her letter to Charlotte, sealed it, and set it aside to send at first light. Then she turned her attention to the practical matters of her plan. She counted the coins in her private purse, far too few for the journey north, and her eyes fell on the small wooden box where she kept her mother's sapphire pendant, one of the only possessions in this grand house that had come to her through love rather than duty. Selling it would break something in her, she knew. but holding on to it while her grandmother died alone would break something far worse. The following morning, she rode to the village under the pretense of visiting the dressmaker, Margaret at her side as chaperone and co-conspirator. In a quiet shop near the edge of town, a jeweler with kind eyes and no interest in gossip offered her a fair price for the pendant, enough, with what she already had, to secure passage north and lodging along the way. She left the shop with a heaviness in her chest and a strange, fragile relief settling in beside it. It was on the ride back to Windmere Hall that she encountered Sebastian again, his horse falling into step beside her carriage as their paths crossed on the country road. He seemed to sense immediately that something weighed on her, and when she confessed, carefully and without full detail, that she intended to travel north soon to see her ailing grandmother, his offer of assistance returned, gentler this time, less an overture and more a genuine concern for a woman he had come to see as a friend. "You need not do this alone, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the simple sound of it, spoken without the weight of duty or disappointment behind it, struck her more than she expected. "If your husband cannot spare the time to see you safely to your family, allow me to arrange an escort for at least part of the journey. Nothing improper, only practical. You are very generous, Lord Hale." "Sebastian, please. And I am not being generous. I am being a decent person, which apparently has become a rare enough thing that it surprises you." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the kind that had grown scarce in her life since her wedding day. "Forgive me. I have simply grown unaccustomed to kindness offered without complication." "Then I hope you will grow accustomed to it again." His eyes held hers a moment longer than was strictly proper, and Eleanor felt a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She looked away first, unsettled by how easily this stranger had found the parts of her that Julian had never bothered to look for. She did not accept his offer of an escort that day, telling herself it would be improper, that Margaret's company would be sufficient, that she did not need a man she barely knew involving himself further in her private affairs. But she carried the warmth of his attention with her back to Windmere Hall, and it sat uneasily alongside the guilt she felt for feeling anything at all beyond friendship toward a man who was not her husband. That night, as she finished the last details of her plan with Margaret's help, Eleanor allowed herself to admit, only to herself, only in the privacy of her own thoughts, that some small part of her had begun to wonder what her life might have looked like if she had married a man who looked at her the way Sebastian Hale did, openly, warmly, as though she were the most interesting person in any room she entered. She pushed the thought away as soon as it formed, ashamed of it, and focused instead on the letter she had already written and the plan that would carry her north before the week was through, before her grandmother's candle burned down entirely, before Julian could delay her one more time with obligations that always seemed to matter more than she did. By the time the candle in her own chamber burned down to nothing, a plan had fully formed in her mind, one that would carry her out of Windmere Hall and away from a marriage that had taught her, slowly and painfully, that some silences could not be waited out, only left behind. The house had never felt so much like a cage as it did in the days that followed, every corridor and closed door pressing in on Eleanor as she counted the hours until she could finally leave it behind. Charlotte's letters grew shorter and more desperate. Constance had stopped taking food. She slept most of the day and asked, in her waking moments, whether her granddaughter was coming. Eleanor read each letter with her hands trembling, and her resolve hardening, and she told herself, again and again, that she was doing the right thing, the only thing left to do. Julian remained as distant as ever, buried in correspondence that seemed to multiply with every day that passed, meetings with his steward that stretched from morning until well past dinner, letters to men Eleanor had never met about matters he never explained to her. She began to notice, in these final days, a strange tension in him that had not been there before, a restlessness beneath his usual composure that she could not account for, and did not have the patience left to investigate. She did not know that Julian, too, was fighting a private battle, that the papers on his desk had begun to blur before his eyes, as thoughts of his wife's cold silence crept in where numbers should have been. She did not know that he had stood outside her chamber door more than once in the past week, his hand raised to knock, only to lower it again and walk away, uncertain what words could possibly bridge 3 years of distance in a single conversation. She knew only what he showed her, and what he showed her was nothing at all. The evening she chose to leave arrived without ceremony, an ordinary Tuesday that would become, in her memory, the night everything changed. Margaret had helped her pack a single small case earlier that afternoon, tucking it beneath a loose floorboard in Eleanor's dressing room, where it would not be discovered by the housekeeper's daily inspection. A modest traveling dress, plain and unadorned, waited folded at the bottom of the case. Nothing that would mark her as a duchess to anyone she might encounter on the road. Eleanor had counted her coin 3 times that day, more from nervous habit than any real doubt about the sum. Dinner that evening was, as it had become custom, a solitary affair. Julian sent word through a servant that he would be delayed again, some matter with a tenant dispute that could not wait until morning. Eleanor accepted the message with a calm that surprised even her, understanding now that this was simply the shape of her marriage, and understanding too that after tonight, it would no longer be a shape she had to live inside. She ate little, retired early, and dismissed Margaret from her chamber earlier than usual, the 2 women exchanging a final look heavy with everything they could not say aloud should a servant be listening at the door. Margaret would meet her at the side gate at 11 o'clock with the small case and a lantern, having arranged for a hired carriage to wait a quarter-mile down the road, far enough from the house that its wheels would not be heard from the windows. Eleanor sat alone in her chamber as the clock ticked toward the appointed hour, and in those final minutes, doubt crept in despite everything she had told herself over the preceding weeks. She thought of her wedding day, of the hope she had carried then, foolish as it seemed now, that a stranger might become a companion given enough time and patience. She thought of small moments over the years that had almost suggested something warmer beneath Julian's composed exterior, a hand that had lingered a moment too long on hers during a formal dance, a look she had caught him giving her once across a crowded room before he realized she had seen it and looked quickly away. She had built entire fantasies from such small moments, she realized now, fantasies that had sustained her through years of otherwise empty silence. She thought, too, of Sebastian's easy warmth, his open interest in her thoughts, his offer, repeated gently over their recent encounters, that she need not carry every burden alone. She did not fully understand her own feelings where he was concerned, and she chose, in this final hour before her departure, not to examine them too closely. Tonight was about her grandmother. Whatever else existed in her heart could wait for calmer days. At 10:30 she rose from her chair and changed quickly into the plain traveling dress Margaret had prepared, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her dressing table, hardly recognizing the woman staring back, a woman about to do something no duchess of her acquaintance would ever dare. Before she left, she paused at the small writing desk near the window and considered, one final time, whether to leave a note. She had drafted several over the preceding days, tearing each one apart before finishing it, unable to find words that captured everything she wanted to say without saying too much. In the end, she wrote nothing. She would send word once she had safely arrived at her grandmother's cottage, once she was far enough away that Julian's response, whatever it might be, could not stop her from doing what needed to be done. She removed her wedding ring instead, setting it carefully on the nightstand where he would be certain to find it, a message clearer than any letter could have written. She was not abandoning her marriage forever, not in her own mind, not yet. But she needed him to understand, in this one unmistakable gesture, that his silence had finally cost him something he could not simply ignore. The house was quiet as she made her way down the servants' staircase, Margaret waiting at the bottom with a shielded lantern and a face full of worry that she tried, unsuccessfully, to hide. "Are you certain, my lady?" "I have never been more certain of anything." They moved together through the dark corridors, past the kitchen where the last of the staff had already retired for the night, out through a side door that Margaret had oiled quietly that morning to prevent any telltale creak. The night air was cool and smelled of rain, though the sky above remained clear, scattered with stars that seemed impossibly bright after the dim candlelight of the house. They crossed the garden quickly, keeping to the shadows along the hedge line, and reached the side gate without incident. Margaret unlocked it with a key she had borrowed from the gardener's shed days earlier, and the 2 women slipped through into the lane beyond, where the promised carriage waited exactly where it had been arranged, its driver a discreet man Margaret had found through a cousin who worked at a coaching inn 2 villages away. Eleanor turned back once, just once, to look at Windmere Hall rising dark and silent against the night sky, its windows unlit except for the faint glow of Julian's study, still occupied at this late hour. She wondered, briefly, what he was doing in there. What could possibly matter more to him than the wife slipping away from his house in the darkness? She did not linger on the thought. There was no answer waiting for her in that lit window, only more of the same silence that had driven her to this moment. "Take care of yourself, Margaret, and thank you for everything. Send word the moment you arrive, my lady. I will worry every hour until I hear you are safe." Eleanor embraced the older woman briefly, an impropriety neither of them cared to notice in the darkness, and then climbed into the waiting carriage. The driver, a quiet man with a weathered face who asked no questions, snapped the reins, and the carriage lurched forward into the night, carrying Eleanor away from the only home she had known for 3 years, and toward a woman she loved who might not survive the week. She did not look back again. The road north was long and rough in places, the carriage jolting over ruts that the spring rains had carved into the packed earth. Eleanor sat with her small case clutched on her lap, watching the darkened countryside slip past the window, her mind a tangle of grief for her grandmother and something else, something she was only beginning to recognize as relief. For the first time in years, she was making a decision entirely her own, answering to no one, bound by no expectation but the pull of her own heart toward the person who had always, unconditionally, loved her. They stopped once, near midnight, at a small coaching inn to change horses and allow the driver a brief rest. Eleanor remained inside the carriage, unwilling to risk being recognized even in this quiet corner of the countryside, though she doubted anyone here would know the face of the Duchess of Ashcombe. She accepted a cup of weak tea from the innkeeper's wife and drank it slowly, watching through the window as the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of a night that felt, somehow, longer than any she had lived through before. It was during this brief stop that her thoughts turned, unbidden and unwelcome, to what Julian would find when he finally returned to her empty chamber. She imagined him opening the door, expecting to find her asleep or reading by candlelight as she so often was, and finding instead an empty bed and a ring left behind on the nightstand. She wondered what he would feel in that moment. She wondered if he would feel anything at all, or if his composure would hold even against this, if he would simply assume she had gone to visit a friend and think no more of it until morning. She did not know, could not have known, sitting in that quiet coaching inn with her tea growing cold in her hands, that at that very moment, miles behind her, Julian Whitmore was climbing the stairs of Windmere Hall, with the intention of finally, having the conversation he had avoided for 3 years. A conversation about his own fears, about the ghost of a woman named Isabel who had taught him that loving someone meant risking losing them, about the wife he had kept at arm's length not from indifference but from a terror so old and so deep he had never found the courage to name it aloud. She did not know that he had made his own decision that night, sitting alone in his study long after the last candle should have been extinguished, a decision to finally open the door he had kept locked between them since their wedding day. She did not know that he would reach her chamber only minutes after her carriage pulled away from the coaching inn to continue its journey north, that he would push open her door with something almost like hope in his chest for the first time in longer than he could remember, only to find the room empty, the bed untouched, and a single ring catching the moonlight on the nightstand where his wife had left it. The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying Eleanor further from Windmere Hall with every passing mile, while behind her, in a house grown suddenly and terribly silent, her husband stood frozen in the doorway of an empty room, understanding, in one devastating instant, exactly how much he had lost through years of silence he had never intended to be cruel, only safe, only careful, only enough to keep his heart from breaking a second time. He did not know where she had gone. He did not know if she intended to return, and for the first time since the death of the woman he had loved and lost, before Eleanor ever entered his life, Julian Whitmore felt something crack open inside his chest that he could no longer contain, no longer bury beneath ledgers and correspondence, and the careful, practiced distance that had defined every day of his marriage. He picked up the ring with hands that were not entirely steady, and he understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to do him any good that night, that he had spent 3 years protecting himself from exactly the kind of loss he had just caused with his own silence. Julian sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the ring pressed between his fingers, and for a long while he did nothing at all, simply stared at the empty room as though staring long enough might conjure his wife back into it. The silence pressed in around him, the same silence he had built brick by brick over 3 years without ever once considering what it might cost him, and now, sitting alone in the wreckage of it, he finally understood. He thought of Isabel, the young woman he had loved before duty and fate had taken her from him, dead of a fever before their own wedding could take place. He had been 23 then, certain the world had ended, certain he would never again allow himself to care for another person the way he had cared for her. When his father arranged the match with Eleanor 2 years later, Julian had agreed with a kind of numb resignation, believing that a marriage built on convenience rather than feeling could never hurt him the way love had. He had kept his distance from Eleanor not because he found her lacking, but because some frightened part of him believed that if he never let himself love her, he could never lose her the way he had lost Isabel. It had seemed, for 3 years, like a reasonable enough bargain. Sitting now in her empty chamber, ring in hand, he understood how foolish that bargain had truly been. He had not protected himself from loss at all. He had simply guaranteed it, slowly, quietly, one distant evening at a time, until the woman he had married had finally run out of patience for a husband who gave her nothing to hold on to. He rang for a servant, his voice rougher than he intended when he asked whether anyone had seen the Duchess leave the house. The young footman who answered his summons looked frightened, clearly uncertain how much he should say, and Julian had to steady his own voice before the boy would speak. "I saw nothing myself, Your Grace, but I heard the kitchen door latch sometime before 11. I did not think it my place to inquire." Julian dismissed him and sat alone again, turning the ring over in his fingers, trying to piece together where his wife might have gone in the dead of night, with no word to anyone in the household. He thought of her grandmother, of the letters that had arrived in recent weeks, of his own repeated refusals to grant her the leave she had asked for so plainly, so simply, and which he had denied again and again, in favor of guests and obligations that suddenly felt unbearably small against the weight of what he had just discovered. Guilt settled over him like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. He had known on some level how much his refusal had wounded her. He had seen it in her face at the breakfast table, in the careful, controlled way she had spoken to him afterward, and he had told himself, as he always did, that there would be time later to make amends, that duty came first and feeling could wait. He understood now, far too late, that Eleanor had run out of time to wait for him. He rose from the bed and began pacing the length of her chamber, his mind racing through possibilities. She might have gone north to her grandmother, as she had asked to do so many times. She might have gone to a friend, seeking comfort he had failed to provide. A darker thought crept in, one he tried immediately to push away and could not quite banish. A thought involving the neighboring estate and the charming young lord who had taken up residence there in recent weeks, whose name Julian had heard mentioned more than once in passing conversation, without ever paying it the attention he now realized, with a sick twist in his stomach, that perhaps he should have. He told himself the thought was unworthy of him, unworthy of her. Eleanor had never given him a single reason to doubt her character in 3 years of marriage, even as he had given her every reason to doubt his devotion. But fear, once it took hold, did not care much for fairness, and Julian found himself unable to shake the image of his wife in another man's company, confiding in someone else the thoughts and feelings she had never once been able to share with him. He crossed to the window and looked out over the dark gardens, the same gardens Eleanor must have crossed only hours before, and he made a decision with the same swift certainty that had once, long ago, defined the young man he had been before grief had taught him caution. He would find her. He would find her tonight if he had to ride every road in the county to do it, and he would tell her, finally, everything he had kept locked away since the day they married, every fear, every regret, every quiet moment of caring he had never once allowed himself to voice. He changed quickly out of his evening clothes and into riding attire, calling for his horse to be saddled with an urgency that sent the stable boy scrambling in the darkness. As he waited in the courtyard, the ring still clutched in his closed fist, Julian Whitmore felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, not since the day he had buried Isabel, and vowed never to risk his heart again. He felt afraid, truly and completely afraid, not of loving someone and losing them, but of having already lost the one thing he had never realized mattered so deeply until the very moment it slipped through his fingers into the dark and silent night. The road stretched dark and empty before Julian as he rode from Windmere Hall, his horse's hooves striking a fast, uneven rhythm against the packed earth. He did not know precisely where he was going. He knew only that he could not remain inside that silent house a moment longer, waiting for morning to bring news that might already be too late to matter. His first thought was the neighboring estate, and though shame burned in him even as he turned his horse in that direction, he could not silence the fear that had taken root the moment he found her chamber empty. He arrived at the gates of Hale's newly leased property within the hour, and though the late hour made the visit deeply improper, propriety had stopped mattering to him the instant he found that ring on the nightstand. A sleepy servant answered his insistent knocking, and moments later Sebastian Hale himself appeared in the doorway, dressed hastily, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he took in the sight of the Duke standing on his doorstep at such an hour, wild-eyed and clearly distressed. "Your Grace, has something happened?" "My wife." Julian's voice was rougher than he intended, stripped of the composure that usually governed every word he spoke. "Is she here?" Sebastian's confusion deepened into something more serious. "Here? No, Your Grace. I have not seen the Duchess since a gathering nearly a week ago. Why would you think—" He stopped himself, understanding dawning slowly across his features. "You believe she has left you?" "I do not know what to believe. I found her chamber empty and her ring left behind. I have no notion where she has gone." Sebastian studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from concern to something harder, more direct. "Your Grace, I will speak plainly, though it may not be my place to do so. Eleanor is a woman of remarkable character. If she has left your house tonight, I would wager everything I own that it has nothing to do with any impropriety on her part, and everything to do with a husband who left her no other choice but to act alone." Julian felt the words land like a blow, sharper for their honesty. "You know something. I know that she has spoken to me of her grandmother's illness, and of your refusal to grant her leave to visit. I know that a woman does not vanish into the night without good reason, and I know that whatever reason drove her to it tonight, it was not born of anything I said or did, however much you may wish to believe otherwise in this moment." Sebastian's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, protective in a way that told Julian this man cared for Eleanor's welfare, even if nothing improper had passed between them. "If you wish to find her, Your Grace, I suggest you consider where a woman desperate to reach a dying grandmother might travel, rather than standing on my doorstep accusing me of something that exists only in your own fear." The rebuke stung precisely because it was deserved, and Julian stood silent for a moment, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. "Forgive me. I have handled this badly, from the very beginning. That is not for me to judge." Sebastian's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. "But if you love her, Your Grace, and I believe some part of you must, or you would not be standing here in the middle of the night looking as though your world has ended, then I suggest you stop wasting time at my door and start considering the roads north." Julian thanked him, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of his own shame, and turned his horse back toward Windmere Hall, his mind now racing through a different set of possibilities. If Eleanor had not come here, then she had almost certainly set out for her grandmother's cottage, exactly as she had told him she intended to do, exactly as he had refused to allow, before she had apparently decided his permission was no longer required. He returned to the house near 2 in the morning, calling for his steward despite the hour, demanding to know whether any household funds had been withdrawn recently, whether any carriages had been hired from the local inns, whether anyone among the staff might know something of his wife's whereabouts. The steward, a practical man named Foster who had served the family for over a decade, admitted after some hesitation that Margaret, the Duchess's maid, might know more than she had been asked. Margaret was summoned from her small room off the kitchen, and she arrived pale and clearly frightened, though she said nothing at first, her loyalty to her mistress warring visibly with the fear of what refusing to answer a duke's direct question might cost her. "Margaret." Julian kept his voice as steady as he could manage, aware that frightening the woman further would gain him nothing. "I know you helped her leave. I do not intend to punish you for it. I only need to know where she has gone, and whether she is safe." Margaret's composure finally broke, tears filling her eyes as the weight of the secret she had carried gave way beneath his direct appeal. "She has gone north, Your Grace, to her grandmother's cottage near Ashford Vale. I arranged a carriage for her, a driver known to my cousin. She should be well along the road by now, perhaps halfway there if the horses have held their pace." "Is she alone?" "Quite alone, Your Grace, save for the driver. She would allow no one else to accompany her, though Lord Hale did offer an escort, which she declined." Margaret hesitated, then added, with a courage that surprised even herself, "Forgive my boldness, Your Grace, but she did not leave lightly. She left, because she felt she had no other choice left to her. I have watched her wait for you at that dinner table, more evenings than I can count, and I have watched the light in her go dimmer with every evening you did not come." The words struck harder than anything Sebastian had said, precisely because they came from someone who had witnessed the slow erosion of his marriage from the inside, someone with no reason to soften the truth for his comfort. Julian nodded slowly, unable to offer any defense against an accusation he knew, in his heart, to be entirely fair. "Thank you, Margaret. You have done nothing wrong tonight. I am the one who has failed, not you, and not her." He gave orders for a fresh horse to be prepared immediately, refusing Foster's suggestion that he wait until first light, when the roads would be safer to travel. Every hour that passed felt like an hour Eleanor traveled further from him, further from any chance he might have to say the things he should have said years ago, and he could not bear the thought of waiting even until dawn. As the household scrambled to prepare for his departure, Julian returned briefly to his own study, the room where he had spent so many evenings hiding from the wife he now realized he had never stopped loving, not truly, not even in his most guarded moments. He unlocked a small drawer in his desk that he rarely opened, and from it he withdrew a portrait, small and faded, of a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. Isabel. He looked at the portrait for a long moment, feeling the old grief rise up as it always did, familiar and worn smooth by years of careful avoidance. But alongside the grief, for the first time, came something else, a kind of clarity he had never allowed himself before. Isabel had died through no fault of his own, a fever no physician could have prevented, a loss that had nothing to do with love itself, and everything to do with the cruel randomness of the world. He had spent 7 years treating that loss as proof that love itself was dangerous, that caring for someone too deeply invited disaster, and in doing so he had built a marriage so carefully guarded against pain that he had guaranteed a different kind of loss entirely, slower, quieter, but no less devastating. He set the portrait down gently and closed the drawer, understanding for the first time that honoring Isabel's memory did not require him to withhold his heart from the woman he had actually married. It required, instead, that he finally allow himself to love again, fully and without the fear that had governed every choice he had made since her death. By the time his horse was ready in the courtyard, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first faint suggestion of dawn. Julian mounted quickly, the portrait of Isabel left behind in its drawer where it belonged, a piece of his past rather than a shadow over his future, and turned his horse toward the north road, toward Ashford Vale, toward whatever chance remained for him to reach his wife before the distance between them became permanent. He rode hard through the gray morning light, stopping only briefly to water his horse at a coaching inn, where the innkeeper, half asleep, confirmed that a carriage matching Margaret's description had passed through in the early hours of the night, traveling steadily north. The confirmation gave him a fragile thread of hope to follow, and he pressed onward, the miles falling away beneath him as the sun climbed higher. The road to Ashford Vale wound through open farmland and small villages still waking to the day, and Julian pushed his horse harder than he knew he should, aware that exhausting the animal too early would only slow him further in the end. He forced himself to a steadier pace, though every part of him wanted to gallop the entire distance without pause, and in the enforced calm of that steady ride, his thoughts turned inward, replaying every missed evening, every closed door, every moment he had chosen paperwork over his own wife's company. He thought of the shawl she had once sewn for him, the one Margaret had mentioned in passing years ago, still hanging untouched by the door where he had left it after a brief, awkward thanks that had clearly meant nothing compared to what the gesture had cost her to make. He had not understood, at the time, what such a small act represented. He understood now, riding alone through unfamiliar country with the sun climbing steadily toward noon, that Eleanor had spent 3 years offering him small pieces of herself, and he had accepted each one with polite indifference, never once offering anything of himself in return. He stopped a second time near midday, more for the horse's sake than his own, at a village he did not recognize, where he purchased a hurried meal he barely tasted, and asked the stable hand there whether any carriages had passed through recently. The boy remembered one, a hired carriage with a tired-looking driver, though he could not say how many hours ago it had gone through, only that it had continued on the north road without stopping longer than necessary. Julian pressed on, the ache in his legs and back a distant concern compared to the ache that had settled deeper, somewhere he could not so easily name. He thought of Sebastian Hale's words at the doorstep, the quiet accusation buried in them, and he found he could not resent the man for speaking them, however much they had stung. Sebastian had seen, in a matter of weeks, what Julian himself had failed to see in 3 years of marriage, that Eleanor was a woman worth truly knowing, worth truly loving, and that a husband who could not manage even that basic effort deserved every ounce of the fear now sitting in his chest. He wondered, as the afternoon wore on and the countryside grew more unfamiliar, whether Eleanor's feelings toward Sebastian had grown beyond simple friendship in the weeks since his arrival in the county. The thought no longer brought the same sharp jealousy it had the night before, replaced instead by a quieter, sadder understanding. If she had found comfort in another man's company, comfort he himself had never offered her, the fault lay entirely with him, not with her, and certainly not with a man who had done nothing but treat her with basic human decency. By late afternoon, his horse showing clear signs of fatigue, Julian stopped at a larger coaching inn to secure a fresh mount, unwilling to risk injuring the animal further with the distance still ahead of him. The innkeeper here, a talkative woman with sharp eyes, confirmed that a young lady matching Eleanor's description, traveling with only a driver and a small case, had stopped there in the early hours for tea, before continuing on toward Ashford Vale. She looked troubled, if you don't mind me saying, sir, kept looking out the window like she expected someone to come after her. The words struck Julian with unexpected force, and he found himself wondering, with a fragile and unfamiliar hope, whether some part of Eleanor had wanted him to follow her that night, whether the ring left on the nightstand had been not just a message of departure but also, perhaps, an invitation for him to prove that he could still surprise her after 3 years of predictable silence. He thanked the innkeeper, paid for the fresh horse, and pressed on into the fading afternoon light, the road ahead now familiar territory to the local travelers he passed, all of whom confirmed with growing confidence that Ashford Vale lay only a few more hours distant. He allowed himself, for the first time since finding her chamber empty, a small measure of hope that he might reach her before the day was entirely gone, that he might still have the chance to say everything he had left unsaid for far too long. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon as Julian rode on, the shadows of hedgerows and old stone walls stretching long across the road before him, and with every mile that brought him closer to Ashford Vale, he rehearsed in his mind the words he would say to her, discarding one attempt after another as either too little or too formal, too much like the careful, guarded speech that had failed her for 3 long years. He wanted more than anything to simply tell her the truth, plain and unguarded, and trust that the truth, however imperfect, would matter more to her than any polished apology ever could. Eleanor arrived at Ashford Vale as the first gray light of dawn touched the hills, the small cottage where her grandmother lived appearing at last around a bend in the road like something out of a half-remembered dream. Smoke rose thin and gray from the chimney, and a single candle burned in the front window, a small beacon against the darkness of a night that had felt endless from the confines of the carriage. Charlotte met her at the door before Eleanor had even finished paying the driver, the older woman's face etched with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "You came. Oh, thank heaven you came. How is she?" "Weaker each day, but she has held on. I believe some part of her was waiting for you." Charlotte led her quickly through the small entryway, past the modest sitting room where a fire burned low, toward the bedroom at the back of the cottage where Constance Bellamy lay propped against a bank of pillows, her face pale and thin in a way that made Eleanor's heart clench painfully in her chest. "Grandmother." Constance's eyes opened slowly, and though the effort clearly cost her something, a smile broke across her face, faint but unmistakably genuine. "Eleanor, my dear girl, you came." Eleanor crossed the room quickly and knelt beside the bed, taking her grandmother's frail hand in both of hers, the papery skin cool despite the warmth of the room. "Of course I came. I would have come sooner, if I could have." "I know." Constance's voice was little more than a whisper, but her eyes held a sharpness that illness had not entirely dimmed. "I know exactly what kept you away, child. You need not explain it to me." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, grateful and grieved all at once, and she stayed at her grandmother's bedside through the remainder of that first day, holding her hand, reading to her from a favorite book of poetry, listening to fragments of stories Constance had told her 100 times before but which felt, now, more precious than they ever had. She did not think of Windmere Hall. She did not think of Julian, or of the ring she had left on the nightstand, or of the message that ring surely delivered to a husband who had never once needed to interpret her actions so carefully before. For those first hours, there was only her grandmother, and the desperate, tender work of loving someone while there was still time left to do it. It was near evening when Constance, her strength briefly returned after a period of rest, asked the question Eleanor had been dreading since her arrival. "Tell me about your husband, Eleanor. The truth this time, not the careful answer you gave me on your wedding day." Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to burden a dying woman with the full weight of her unhappiness, but Constance's steady gaze made clear that anything less than honesty would be recognized and rejected immediately. "He does not see me, grandmother, not truly. We have lived under the same roof for 3 years, and I do not believe he knows the first thing about who I am, what I love, what frightens me. He is not unkind, not exactly. He is simply absent, even when he stands in the same room." Constance was quiet for a long moment, her thin fingers tightening slightly around Eleanor's hand. "And is that the life you intend to live, child, beside a man who does not see you?" "I do not know what else there is to do. The marriage is made. There is no undoing it now. There is always something to be done, Eleanor. Even within a marriage that cannot be undone, there is a choice in how you carry yourself through it. You can shrink yourself smaller and smaller, waiting for a man who may never change, or you can decide, as I once had to decide myself, that your own life matters regardless of whether he ever learns to see it." Constance's eyes softened, memory clearly rising behind them. "Your grandfather was much the same, in the early years, distant, careful with his heart in ways that left me feeling invisible more nights than I care to remember." Eleanor stared at her grandmother, surprised by this admission she had never heard before, in all their years of closeness. "You never told me that." There are many things a woman does not tell her granddaughter until the granddaughter is old enough to need the telling. Constance managed a faint, tired smile. He changed, eventually, your grandfather. Not because I waited patiently for it to happen, but because I stopped waiting and started living my own life fully regardless of what he offered me in return. Something in that shift frightened him enough to finally pay attention. Men like that, Eleanor. The careful ones, the guarded ones. They do not change because we ask them to. They change when they fear losing what they have taken for granted. The words settled into Eleanor with a weight she could not immediately name, and she thought of Julian's face in the drawing room days earlier, that brief crack in his composure she had noticed and dismissed. She wondered, not for the first time, what exactly lived behind that careful exterior, what fear or grief he had never once shared with her in 3 years of marriage. She did not have long to wonder before the question found its own strange answer. It was late the following morning, Eleanor having slept only a few restless hours in the small guest room Charlotte had prepared for her, when the sound of a horse's hooves on the lane outside drew her to the cottage window. She looked out and felt her breath catch entirely in her chest. Julian sat astride an unfamiliar horse, travel-worn and disheveled in a way she had never once seen him in 3 years of marriage, his usually immaculate appearance replaced by the dust and exhaustion of a man who had ridden through an entire night and day without proper rest. He dismounted slowly, almost unsteadily, and stood for a moment looking at the small cottage as though gathering the courage to approach it. Eleanor's heart pounded with a confusion of feelings she could not immediately sort through, anger and hope and fear all tangled together, and she found herself moving toward the front door before she had fully decided what she intended to say to him. She opened the door just as he reached it, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing and looking at each other across the threshold. 3 years of unspoken distance suddenly compressed into the space of a few feet, and a silence neither seemed able to break first. Eleanor. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual careful composure. I have been searching for you since I found your chamber empty. You found the ring. I found the ring. He held it up, still clutched in his hand where it had apparently remained through his entire journey. I understood, finally, what it meant. Did you? Eleanor crossed her arms, unwilling to let 3 years of hurt dissolve simply because he had appeared at her grandmother's door, however much some traitorous part of her heart wanted to. And what exactly did you understand, Julian? He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before, not once, in 3 years of careful, controlled conversation. I understood that I have spent our entire marriage protecting myself from you, from the possibility of loving you and losing you, and in doing so, I guaranteed the very loss I feared. I understood that you asked me for one simple thing, permission to see a woman who has loved you your whole life, and I refused it in favor of guests who meant nothing to me, because I could not bear to examine why the thought of you leaving this house, even briefly, frightened me so deeply. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, cautious and unwilling to trust too quickly what she was hearing. You have never spoken to me this way before. I know. I am sorry for that. More sorry than I know how to express standing here after riding through the night like a madman. But I intend to keep speaking this way, Eleanor, if you will allow me the chance. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and something else, something rawer, etched into every line of his face. There was a woman, before you, Isabel. We were to be married, and she died of a fever before the wedding could take place. I was 23, and I decided, in my grief, that loving someone fully meant risking a pain I never wanted to feel again. I married you believing I could keep that promise to myself, could keep enough distance between us that I would never risk what I had lost with her. I was wrong, Eleanor. I have been wrong for 3 years, and I did not understand how wrong until I found your empty chamber and realized I might lose you through my own carelessness, exactly as I lost her through no fault of my own at all. Tears had gathered in Eleanor's eyes despite her determination to remain guarded, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, the weight of his confession settling over her slowly, reshaping everything she had believed about the silent, distant man she had married. Why did you never tell me this before? Because telling you meant admitting it to myself first, and I was too much of a coward to do either. He reached for her hand, hesitant, as though uncertain whether she would allow the touch. I do not ask you to forgive 3 years in a single conversation, Eleanor. I only ask you to let me try, truly try, to become the husband I should have been from the very beginning. Stay here with your grandmother as long as she needs you. I will not ask you to leave a moment before you are ready. But when you are ready, I hope you will come home to a house where I intend to be present in every room of it, not hidden away behind ledgers and old grief. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the exhaustion and sincerity written plainly across features that had always, before now, given her nothing to read. She thought of her grandmother's words from the evening before, about men who changed only when they feared losing what they had taken for granted, and she wondered if this was exactly the reckoning Constance had described, arriving finally after 3 years of silence. "I need time, Julian, not to punish you, but because I have spent 3 years learning to expect nothing from you, and I cannot simply unlearn that in a single morning, however much I might want to. Take whatever time you need. I will not press you further than that." He glanced past her, toward the cottage, toward the room where her grandmother lay resting. "Would it be permitted for me to pay my respects to Lady Bellamy, if she is well enough to receive visitors?" "I understand if the answer is no." Eleanor studied him a moment longer, and something in the humility of the request, so unlike the composed, distant man who had refused her leave to travel only weeks before, softened the guard she had been holding since he first appeared on the lane. "Come inside, but Julian, know this. What happens between us now depends entirely on what you do, not what you say. Words have never been the difficulty between us. It is action that has always been missing. Then I intend to spend whatever time it takes proving that I understand the difference." She stepped aside to let him pass, and as he entered the small, warm cottage that had always felt more like home than Windmere Hall ever had, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, the smallest and most fragile hope that perhaps her husband had finally learned to see her. Charlotte met them in the sitting room, her eyebrows lifting in surprise at the sight of the Duke standing travel-worn and humbled in the doorway of a modest country cottage, so far removed from the grand halls he was accustomed to. She said nothing of her surprise, only led him quietly toward the bedroom where Constance lay resting, and stood aside to let him enter alone with Eleanor. Constance's eyes opened at the sound of footsteps, and though her strength had clearly dimmed further since the previous evening, recognition flickered across her face when she saw the unfamiliar man standing beside her granddaughter. So this is the Duke who finally noticed his wife had left him. Julian, to his credit, did not flinch from the sharpness in the old woman's voice, though color rose faintly in his cheeks. "Lady Bellamy, I owe you an apology I fear can never be sufficient. I refused your granddaughter's request to see you, more than once, and I understand now what that refusal nearly cost all 3 of us." Constance studied him for a long moment with the same sharp, assessing gaze Eleanor had inherited from her, and whatever she found in his face seemed to soften something in her own expression, though her voice remained firm. "Apologies are easily spoken, young man. I have heard a great many of them in my long life, from men far more practiced at charm than you appear to be. What I have not seen nearly so often is a man willing to ride through the night without rest to make one in person. That, at least, tells me something. I intend for it to tell you more than words alone ever could, Lady Bellamy. I do not expect your trust simply because I have arrived at your door. I only hope to earn it, given time." "Time," Constance repeated, something wry in her tone despite her evident exhaustion, "is precisely the one thing I have very little left to offer either of you. But my granddaughter has more of it ahead of her than I do, and I trust she is wise enough to spend it carefully, whatever she decides to do with the man standing before me now." She turned her gaze to Eleanor, her expression gentling considerably. "Sit with me a while longer, child, both of you, if he does not mind a dying woman's rambling stories." Julian pulled a chair close to the bed without hesitation, and for the remainder of that afternoon, the 3 of them sat together in the small warm room, Constance drifting occasionally into sleep and waking again to continue some half-finished tale of her own younger years. Stories Eleanor had heard many times before, but which took on new depth watching Julian listen to each one with genuine, unguarded attention, asking questions at moments that told her he was truly hearing what her grandmother said, rather than simply waiting politely for his turn to speak. It was a small thing, she told herself, watching him lean forward to catch Constance's quieter words, asking about a particular garden her grandmother had once kept, remembering details from earlier in the conversation that showed he had genuinely listened, rather than merely endured the visit out of obligation. But small things, Eleanor was beginning to understand, were exactly what had been missing from her marriage for 3 long years, and their sudden presence now, however overdue, mattered more than she had expected it to. As evening approached, Charlotte gently suggested that Constance had tired herself enough for one day, and Julian rose immediately, taking his leave with a courtesy that felt, for the first time Eleanor could remember, entirely sincere rather than merely practiced. "I have taken a room at the inn in the village," he told Eleanor quietly as they stepped outside into the cooling evening air. "I do not wish to intrude further on your grandmother's household, but I intend to remain nearby for as long as you need me to, whether that means days or weeks." I will not press you for more than you are ready to give, Eleanor, but I could not simply return to Windmere Hall and leave you to face this alone, not after everything my absence has already cost us both. Eleanor looked at him standing there in the fading light, still travel-worn, still carrying an exhaustion that spoke plainly of the desperate ride that had brought him to her grandmother's door, and she felt the last of her guarded anger soften, not into full forgiveness, not yet, but into something gentler, something that allowed room for the possibility of forgiveness to grow given enough honest effort on his part. Thank you for coming, Julian. I did not expect it. I know. That is precisely the trouble I intend to spend the rest of our marriage correcting, if you will allow me the chance to try. She did not answer him directly, uncertain yet what her own heart was prepared to promise, but she found, watching him mount his horse and ride slowly back toward the village in the gathering dusk, that some quiet, cautious part of her had already begun to hope for exactly the kind of future he seemed determined to build, one small, honest gesture at a time. The days that followed settled into a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm, one Eleanor could not remember ever experiencing in 3 years of marriage. Julian remained in the village as he had promised, taking a small room at the local inn, and each morning he arrived at the cottage not with demands or expectations, but simply with his presence, offered freely and without condition. He did not push her to speak of the future. He did not press her to decide, in the midst of her grief and worry over her grandmother's failing health, what their marriage would become once this chapter had ended. He simply arrived, day after day, and made himself useful in ways that surprised her more each time, chopping wood for the cottage's small stove, riding into the village to fetch the physician when Constance's breathing grew labored one difficult night, sitting for hours reading aloud from whatever book Constance requested, his voice steady and patient in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from him before. Charlotte, who had been skeptical of the Duke's sudden appearance and even more sudden transformation, found herself softening toward him as the days passed, remarking to Eleanor one evening that she had rarely seen a man work so hard at something with so little promise of reward. He does not know if I will forgive him, Eleanor admitted quietly, watching through the window as Julian split wood in the small yard behind the cottage, his fine clothes long since abandoned in favor of simpler garments purchased from the village tailor. I have given him no promise of it. And yet he continues, Charlotte observed. That tells you something, my lady, whether you are ready to hear it or not. Eleanor found she could not entirely disagree, though she guarded her heart carefully still, unwilling to trust too quickly a transformation that had arrived so suddenly after 3 years of silence. She watched him closely in those days, searching for any sign that his newfound warmth was merely a performance, meant to secure her forgiveness, rather than a genuine change in the man himself, and she found, to her quiet surprise, no evidence of pretense in anything he did. He simply showed up, again and again, in the small, unglamorous ways that mattered most, and slowly, cautiously, something in Eleanor's guarded heart began to soften toward him. In those quiet days, Eleanor began to notice small changes in herself as well, changes she had not expected and did not entirely know how to name. She found herself waiting less anxiously for signs that Julian's warmth would vanish as quickly as it had appeared, and instead simply allowing herself to enjoy his company for what it was, without constantly measuring it against 3 years of disappointment. It was not forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was something close to it, a loosening of the tight, guarded posture she had carried through so much of her marriage. One afternoon, while Julian sat with Constance discussing, of all things, the proper way to prune roses, a subject he clearly knew nothing about but pursued with genuine curiosity, Eleanor stepped out into the small garden behind the cottage and found herself unexpectedly at ease, humming a tune she had not thought of in years, one her grandmother used to sing while working in her own garden long ago. She realized, standing there in the afternoon sun, that she had not felt this settled, this simply content, in longer than she could easily remember. Sebastian's letter, when it arrived a few days after Constance's passing, was brief and kind, offering condolences and expressing a gentle hope that Eleanor had found some measure of peace in her grief. There was no lingering expectation in his words, no suggestion that he hoped for anything beyond her happiness, and Eleanor read it with quiet gratitude for a friendship that had asked nothing of her beyond honesty and kindness, exactly when she had needed both most. She showed the letter to Julian without hesitation, and he read it with none of the jealousy that had once driven him to Sebastian's doorstep in the middle of the night, only quiet respect for a man who had, in his own way, helped Eleanor find the courage to demand more from her marriage than silence. Constance's decline continued despite Julian's presence and the physician's careful attention. and on a quiet evening nearly 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, she passed peacefully in her sleep, her hand still resting in Eleanor's own. Julian seated on the other side of the bed where he had insisted on keeping vigil through that final difficult night alongside his wife. Eleanor's grief was profound, but it was not, she realized in the days that followed, a lonely grief. Julian remained beside her through the arrangements, through the small quiet funeral held in the village church, through the long, difficult work of settling her grandmother's modest affairs, never once retreating into the distant, absent version of himself that had defined their marriage for 3 years. He simply stayed, present in every difficult moment, offering not empty words of comfort but the steady, quiet company of a man who had finally learned what his wife needed most. It was on the evening after the funeral, the two of them sitting together in the small cottage sitting room, the fire burning low and Charlotte having retired early to give them privacy, that Eleanor finally found the courage to ask the question that had lingered unspoken between them since his arrival. "Why did it take my leaving for you to see me, Julian? I do not ask to punish you. I ask because I need to understand, if we are to build something different going forward, what changed in you, and whether it will hold once we return to Windmere Hall and its old routines reassert themselves." Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the guarded composure that had once defined every conversation between them. "I think, in truth, some part of me always saw you, Eleanor. I simply would not allow myself to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it meant admitting how much I had to lose. It was easier, in a cowardly way, to keep you at a careful distance, to treat our marriage as an arrangement rather than a partnership, because an arrangement could not break my heart the way a true partnership could. And now I understand that the distance itself was the greater danger, not the closeness I feared. I nearly lost you through my own carelessness, exactly as I once lost Isabel through no fault of my own, and the difference matters more than I can easily express. Isabel's death taught me that love could be taken from me without warning. Your departure taught me that love could also be lost through simple, cowardly neglect, one silent evening at a time, and that the second kind of loss is entirely within my power to prevent, if only I choose, every single day, to actually show up for the person I have promised to spend my life beside." Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, searching for any trace of the careful, guarded man she had married, and finding instead someone who seemed, for the first time, entirely present with her, holding nothing back. "I do not know how to simply forget 3 years, Julian. I do not think that would be honest of either of us to pretend. I do not ask you to forget them. I ask only for the chance to spend however many years remain to us, proving that the man sitting beside you now is the man you will continue to have, not merely a version of myself I performed for a few desperate weeks to win back your favor." He reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate to let him take it. "I love you, Eleanor. I believe some part of me has loved you for longer than I allowed myself to admit, and I intend to spend the rest of our marriage making certain you never again have reason to doubt it." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, and this time she did not try to hold them back. "I have wanted to hear those words from you for 3 years, Julian. I did not think I ever would. I am sorry it took nearly losing you to find the courage to say them. I will not make that mistake again." They sat together in the quiet cottage as the fire burned down to embers, and though Eleanor did not offer him full forgiveness that night, something had shifted between them, a foundation laid where none had existed before, built not on the desperate promises of a single emotional evening, but on 2 weeks of steady, quiet proof that the man she had married was finally willing to become the husband she had always hoped he might be. They remained at the cottage another fortnight, settling Constance's affairs and allowing Eleanor the time she needed to properly grieve. Julian handled the practical matters with a quiet efficiency that surprised her, arranging for the cottage to be kept as it was rather than sold, understanding without needing to be told that Eleanor would want a place of her own to retreat to whenever the weight of Windmere Hall grew heavy. A small piece of independence he offered freely rather than one she had to fight for. In the evenings, once the day's arrangements were finished, they often walked together along the same lane where Eleanor had first watched him arrive on his tired, unfamiliar horse. And in those quiet walks, away from servants and obligations and the watching eyes of society, they began to speak to each other as they never truly had before, not as Duke and Duchess bound by contract, but simply as two people slowly, carefully learning who the other one actually was. Eleanor told him of the small rebellions she had allowed herself over the years, the green curtains in the library he had never once noticed, the letters she had written to him and never sent, tucked away in her writing desk as a private record of everything she had once hoped their marriage might become. Julian read them one evening, with her permission, and wept quietly over words she had written in her loneliest hours, understanding at last the full measure of what his silence had cost her. He told her in turn of Isabel, more fully than he had managed that first desperate morning at the cottage door, of the wedding that never happened, of the years afterward when he had thrown himself into estate matters and correspondence simply to avoid the empty space grief had carved into him. He told her of his father's own cold marriage, the model he had unconsciously followed without ever questioning whether it was the only model available to him, and Eleanor listened without judgment, understanding better than most how deeply a person's history could shape the walls they built around their own heart. By the time they finally made the journey back to Windermere Hall together, side by side in the same carriage rather than separate and distant as they had traveled through so much of their marriage before, something had genuinely shifted between them, a foundation no longer built on old wounds and careful avoidance, but on the harder, more honest work of two people who had finally chosen to know each other fully. Sebastian Hale sent a brief, kind letter upon their return, wishing them both well and expressing quiet relief that Eleanor had found her way back to a marriage worth saving, a gesture of genuine friendship that Eleanor received with warm gratitude, and Julian, to his credit, accepted without a trace of the jealousy that had driven him to Sebastian's doorstep weeks before. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Old habits proved harder to break than either of them expected, and there were evenings when Julian's work threatened to pull him back into the familiar distance of ledgers and correspondence. Evenings when Eleanor found herself watching the clock with old, wary suspicion, waiting to see whether the change in him would truly hold. But each time the old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, Julian caught himself, choosing his wife's company over his papers with a deliberateness that spoke of genuine effort rather than empty promise, and slowly, month by month, Eleanor's guarded heart opened further, trust rebuilding itself one honest evening at a time. By the time autumn returned to Windermere Hall, the gardens blazing with the same colors that had once seemed so lonely to Eleanor when she watched them from an empty breakfast room, something had changed fundamentally in the house itself. Dinner had become a shared occasion rather than a solitary one, Julian arriving each evening not out of obligation but genuine eagerness to hear about his wife's day, to share his own thoughts and worries in return, building slowly the kind of true partnership neither of them had believed possible in the early, silent years of their marriage. When the Whitmores returned to society that winter for the first grand ball of the season, those who had known them in earlier years remarked quietly to one another on the change that had come over the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe, a warmth between them that had never before been visible in public, a way Julian had of watching his wife across a crowded room with open, unguarded affection, rather than the careful indifference he had once worn like armor. Eleanor caught his eye across the ballroom that evening, and where once such a look from him would have meant nothing, would have passed between them like strangers exchanging polite acknowledgement, now it carried the full weight of everything they had built together since that desperate night she had left her wedding ring on the nightstand and disappeared into the darkness before midnight. He crossed the room to her, offering his hand for a dance he would once never have thought to request, and as they moved together through the familiar steps, surrounded by the glittering crowd of a society that had once known them only as strangers bound by contract, Eleanor understood that the marriage she had nearly walked away from had become, finally and completely, the partnership she had hoped for since the very beginning, not because either of them had been perfect, but because both of them had finally learned that love required more than simply existing in the same house together. It required showing up, again and again, in all the small and difficult ways that mattered most, and choosing, every single day, to truly see the person standing beside you. Later that night, after the ball had ended and the carriage carried them home through quiet, moonlit country roads, Julian reached for her hand in the darkness, and Eleanor let him hold it, no longer bracing herself against the possibility that his warmth might vanish come morning. She had spent 3 years learning to expect silence from her husband, and it had taken losing him, however briefly, to teach them both that a marriage built on quiet endurance was no marriage at all, only a slow kind of loneliness, dressed in the appearance of companionship. "I used to dread these carriage rides," she admitted softly, watching the hedgerows slip past the window in the pale moonlight. "I would sit across from you and wonder what I had done wrong, why you could not simply speak to me the way you spoke so easily to your steward, to your tenants, to nearly anyone who was not your own wife." Julian's grip on her hand tightened gently. "You did nothing wrong, Eleanor. Not then, and not in all the months since. The fault was entirely mine, born of a fear I finally understand well enough to keep at bay, though I do not think it will ever vanish completely. Grief has a way of lingering, even once we have made peace with it. I do not ask it to vanish. I only ask that you continue choosing me over it, The way you have chosen these past months. That is a promise I intend to keep for as long as I am given breath to keep it." She rested her head against his shoulder as the carriage rolled on through the dark countryside, and for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor felt no uncertainty about the future stretching ahead of her. Windmere Hall, once a house of 40 silent rooms, had slowly become something else entirely, a home built not on contract or convenience, but on the harder, more honest work of two people choosing each other, again and again, through every ordinary evening that made up a life shared truly, rather than merely endured. When they arrived back at the great house, its windows glowing warm with candlelight against the winter night, Julian helped her down from the carriage himself, waving away the waiting footman with a small, private smile meant only for her. They walked together up the wide stone steps, hand in hand, into a home that had finally, after everything, become exactly what a home was always meant to be. Spring returned to Windmere Hall a year after the night Eleanor had vanished before midnight, and with it came a letter that threatened, briefly, to unsettle the peace the household had worked so hard to build. The letter came from Julian's aunt, a formidable woman named Beatrice who had never approved of the match with Eleanor, believing her nephew ought to have secured a bride from a family of greater fortune and older lineage. Beatrice wrote to announce her intention to visit Windmere Hall for a fortnight, bringing with her a young woman she described, pointedly, as an old family friend, the daughter of an earl, unmarried, and, in Beatrice's words, entirely suited to the position of duchess should circumstances ever change. Eleanor read the letter at breakfast, her hands tightening slightly around the paper before she set it down with a composure that did not entirely match what she felt inside. A year of steady rebuilding between herself and Julian had left her more secure in their marriage than she had ever thought possible. But old wounds, she was learning, did not disappear entirely simply because new trust had grown over them. A part of her, small but persistent, wondered whether Beatrice's visit was intended as more than simple family courtesy. She said nothing of her worry to Julian that morning, watching instead as he read the same letter with an expression that shifted from mild irritation to something firmer, more decisive. "My aunt has never approved of much in my life," he said, folding the letter and setting it aside with a finality that told Eleanor he considered the matter closed before it had even properly begun. "I will write to her today and make clear that Windmere Hall welcomes family visits, but not matchmaking schemes conducted under my own roof, and certainly not while my wife sits at this very table. You need not defend me so quickly, Julian. I am capable of handling your aunt's opinions. I do not doubt your capability for a moment, but I have spent enough of our marriage failing to defend you when it mattered, and I do not intend to make that mistake again, over something as small and unnecessary as my aunt's outdated notions of a proper duchess." He reached across the table for her hand, his expression softening. "You are the only duchess I have any interest in, Eleanor, now or ever. I would like my aunt to understand that clearly before she sets foot in this house." Eleanor felt the last of her quiet worry dissolve at the simple certainty in his voice, and she found herself smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with old anxieties and everything to do with how thoroughly her husband had changed in the year since she had left her wedding ring on a nightstand and ridden away into the darkness. Beatrice arrived a week later exactly as promised, the young earl's daughter, a pleasant but visibly uncomfortable young woman named Grace, trailing somewhat awkwardly in her wake, clearly aware that she had been brought along for a purpose she had not fully consented to. Eleanor, rather than treating Grace with the wariness Beatrice's letter might have justified, welcomed her warmly from the very first afternoon, sensing quickly that the young woman was as much a pawn in Beatrice's scheming as an active participant in it. Over the following days, Eleanor and Grace found an unexpected friendship growing between them, bonding over a shared love of poetry and a mutual, quietly amused understanding of exactly how uncomfortable Beatrice's intentions had made them both. Julian, for his part, remained unfailingly attentive to Eleanor throughout the visit, ensuring that his aunt witnessed, at every turn, a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than the cold arrangement she had apparently expected to find. Beatrice, to her credit, was not an unintelligent woman, and by the fourth evening of her visit, watching Julian across the dinner table as he laughed openly at something Eleanor had said, a warmth in his expression that had never once been present in his younger years, even before his engagement to Isabel, the older woman finally set aside her scheming with something approaching grace of her own. "I confess I misjudged the situation," she admitted to Eleanor one afternoon, the two women walking alone through the gardens while Julian showed Grace the estate's small library. "I had heard, through various channels over the years, that this marriage was a cold one, convenient but empty. I see now that whatever coldness once existed has been thoroughly resolved. It was not resolved easily, Eleanor admitted honestly. There were years when your assessment would have been entirely accurate. And yet here you both are. Beatrice studied her for a moment, something almost approving in her sharp gaze. I will not pretend I understand exactly what changed between you, but I recognize genuine affection when I see it, whatever my earlier intentions in bringing Grace along might have suggested. You have my apology, my dear, and my genuine best wishes going forward. The remainder of Beatrice's visit passed without further complication, and by the time she and Grace departed, a friendship had been forged between Eleanor and the young woman that would continue through letters for years to come, an unexpected gift born from a visit that had begun with such uncertain intentions. That summer brought news that filled Windmere Hall with a different kind of joy entirely, Eleanor discovering she was carrying their first child, a piece of news that Julian received with an emotion so open and unguarded that Eleanor found herself laughing through her own tears at the sight of her composed, careful husband, entirely undone by happiness for the first time in the years she had known him. He accompanied her to every appointment with the physician, read every book on the subject he could find, and spent long evenings simply sitting with her hand resting against her growing belly, speaking quietly to a child not yet born about the world that awaited them, a tenderness that would have seemed impossible to imagine in the distant, silent man Eleanor had married 5 years before. Their daughter arrived on a cold morning in early winter, healthy and loud-voiced, and they named her Constance, after the grandmother whose wisdom had guided Eleanor through the darkest and most transformative weeks of her marriage. Julian held his daughter for the first time with an expression of wonder so complete that Eleanor understood, watching him, that whatever fear had once governed his heart had finally, fully released its hold. Windmere Hall, once a house of 40 silent rooms, filled slowly with the sound of a child's laughter in the years that followed, and Eleanor, watching her husband chase their daughter through the same gardens where she had once stood alone in the rain grieving a marriage that felt hopeless, understood that every difficult step of their journey, the silence, the departure, the desperate ride north, had led them, finally, to exactly the life she had once believed impossible to build with him. She thought, sometimes, of that night she had left her ring on the nightstand and slipped away into the darkness before midnight, and she felt no regret for having done it, understanding now that sometimes love required exactly that kind of courage, the willingness to walk away from a comfortable silence in order to demand something truer, something worth the risk of losing everything to gain. Julian had panicked that night, finding her gone, and in his panic he had finally found the courage to become the husband she had always hoped he might be. Eleanor liked to think, watching him now with their daughter held high against the autumn sky, that some part of her had known, even in her most desperate hour, that leaving was the only way either of them would ever truly find their way home. Margaret remained in their household through all of it, now holding a position of trust and warmth that went far beyond her original duties, often the one entrusted with young Constance during the long evenings, when Julian insisted on taking his wife walking through the gardens alone, a habit he had kept faithfully every single day since their reconciliation, rain or shine, insisting that a marriage required tending exactly the way a garden did, with patient, daily attention rather than occasional grand gestures. Sebastian Hale married 2 years later, a quiet, cheerful woman from a neighboring county, and he wrote to Eleanor with genuine warmth to share the news, an invitation that Eleanor and Julian accepted together, attending the wedding as friends rather than the awkward triangle their earlier history might have suggested. Julian shook Sebastian's hand at the celebration with a sincerity that surprised even himself, grateful, in a way he had never expected to feel toward another man, for the gentle push Sebastian's honesty had given him on that desperate night years before, the words spoken at a doorstep that had forced Julian to finally see the truth of what his silence had cost. As the years passed, Windmere Hall became known throughout the county not for its grand parties or its careful formal hospitality, but for the warmth that visitors immediately noticed upon crossing its threshold, a warmth that had been entirely absent in the years before Eleanor's desperate midnight departure had forced her husband to finally confront the fear that had governed every choice he made. Julian took to spending his mornings with his growing family before ever touching his correspondence, a small habit that would have seemed impossible to the distant, guarded man he had once been, and Eleanor found, watching her husband kneel in the nursery each morning to greet their daughter with unguarded delight, that she no longer recognized any trace of the cold stranger she had married. On the 5th anniversary of the night she had left her ring on the nightstand, Julian surprised her with a small gift, a new ring to sit beside the one she had never stopped wearing since her return, engraved with a simple inscription that read only, "I see you now, and always will." Eleanor wept openly at the gesture, understanding in that small, quiet moment exactly how far they had traveled together since the desperate darkness of that first departure. She kept her grandmother's cottage exactly as Julian had promised, visiting often with their growing family, teaching young Constance to prune roses in the same small garden where Eleanor herself had once found unexpected peace during the darkest weeks of her life. She told her daughter, in time, small pieces of the story, carefully chosen for a child's understanding, about a mother who had once needed to be brave enough to leave in order to find her way back to a love worth keeping, and a father who had learned, through fear and desperate searching, exactly what it meant to truly see the person standing beside him. It was not a story of perfect people, Eleanor understood, looking back on those transformative weeks with the clarity that only years of happiness could provide. It was a story of two flawed, frightened people who had nearly lost each other through silence and grief, and who had found their way back only because one of them had finally been brave enough to stop waiting for change and demand it instead. That courage, more than any single conversation or desperate midnight ride, had built the foundation of everything that followed, a marriage no longer defined by what either of them feared to lose, but by everything they had chosen, deliberately and daily, to build together instead.